Pharmaceutical costs are one of the primary reasons that the U.S. spends a disproportionate amount of its GDP on healthcare. Drug prices in the U.S. far exceed those in other countries, and the drug makers argue that they must charge these prices in the U.S. in order to cover their costs of research and development. One glaring example of rising costs is that of insulin. As we have seen, insulin costs have nearly doubled from 2012 through 2016. In 2019, they have risen even further. This price increase has resulted in deaths as many patients begin to ration their supplies in order to make them last longer. Why is this happening? In a word, greed. Large manufacturers of insulin, Sanofi, Eli Lilly, and Novo Nordisk, have owned the market and even sued generic makers of insulin in order to stop them from competing with a cheaper product. Insulin is a very profitable market for these three pharma giants, and this market continues to expand. In 1999, Eli Lilly sold $700 million worth of insulin in the U.S., according to SEC filings. In 2017, Lilly took in $2.6 billion for just two of its insulin products. Remember, the first insulin vial was sold for $1. There are also regulatory hurdles as well, but Scott Gottlieb, who recently stepped down as FDA chief, has been working to address them in hopes of promoting more timely and less costly approval for generic equivalents. Other drugs are costing Americans more as well. This is not just limited to insulin. And we can't really place all the blame for rising drug prices on name brand pharma companies. This past week, Teva Pharmaceuticals was found to have been colluding with other generic drug manufacturers to raise the cost of more than 100 generic everyday drugs, from antibiotics to statins. That company now faces a lawsuit from the attorneys generals of nearly 43 states. But here's my take. We must begin to hold those responsible for maliciously raising drug prices accountable. The government must begin to impose stiff penalties, and we have to separate the pharma lobby from the pockets of those in Washington, D.C. Easier said than done, right? The U.S. can no longer afford to bear the brunt of the costs of R&D for the world. Just as in many developed European countries, I believe that we must set limits on what drug manufacturers can charge. We must allow the import of medications from other countries when necessary in an effort to drive down the cost of U.S. drugs. There will be a fair amount of work involved in this process, as our FDA has to inspect these foreign plants and ensure that they are making an acceptable product that will be safe and effective for U.S. patients. Ultimately, we have to advocate for our patients. It's no longer acceptable, or really never acceptable, for a young person to die because they can't afford their insulin. It's also not acceptable for a person who's recovered from a heart attack to have a second event because they could not afford to take secondary prevention medicines such as ACE inhibitors, statins, and beta blockers. We must have price transparency, and patients should be able to shop around for both medications and care. As physicians, we have to stand up and be counted. Let your voice be heard. Our patients and their families depend on it.